Chapter 1. A Curious Summons. It was during the bitter January of 1895, when London lay shrouded beneath a pall of fog so dense that gaslights appeared as nothing more than diffused halos in the murky air, that my friend Sherlock Holmes received a most peculiar telegram. We had been sitting in companionable silence before the crackling fire in our Baker Street lodgings, Holmes engrossed in his latest monograph on the variations of cigar ash, while I pored over recent medical journals. The sharp ring of the bell below broke our quiet evening, followed shortly by Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread upon the 17 steps leading to our quarters. She entered with a yellow telegram envelope upon her silver tray. "A messenger just delivered this, Mr. Holmes," she said. "The poor lad was half frozen and quite insistent it required your immediate attention." Holmes took the envelope with a languid gesture that belied the keen interest I detected in his eyes. As our landlady departed, he tore open the envelope and scanned its contents, his expression revealing subtle signs of intrigue. "Well, Watson," he said at length, "it seems we may soon have an opportunity to exchange this stifling London atmosphere for the more bracing air of Northumberland. A case, Holmes?" "Indeed." He passed the telegram to me. "Read it aloud if you would." I cleared my throat and read, "Require immediate assistance. Stop matter of life and death. Stop Abbey haunted by impossible scream. Stop one dead already stop. Locals speak of ancient curse. Stop rational explanation. Eludes me. Stop will pay any fee. Stop come tonight if possible. Stop Lord Edmund Blackwood Ravencroft. Abbey Northumberland." "Rather melodramatic," I remarked. "Impossible scream and ancient curse hardly seem the language of someone seeking rational investigation." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what interests me. Lord Edmund Blackwood is not known for flights of fancy. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society, with numerous published works on natural philosophy and geology. For such a man to employ such language suggests circumstances that have severely tested his scientific sensibilities. You know of him, then?" "By reputation only. His studies on the mineral compositions of the Northumberland coast are quite definitive." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, peering into the impenetrable fog. What could have rattled such a methodical mind, I wonder? We arranged to depart on the first morning train. As I packed my valise, Holmes immersed himself in reference materials on Northumberland history. "What do you know of Ravencroft Abbey?" I asked. "A medieval foundation, originally Cistercian until the dissolution. The Blackwood family acquired it during Elizabeth I's reign. The current structure is largely Tudor, with some medieval elements preserved. More germane to our investigation, perhaps, is that the Abbey sits on a dramatic cliff overlooking the North Sea, in a region historically rife with smuggling activity. You think this matter might involve smugglers?" "I think, Watson, that we have insufficient data to form any hypotheses at this stage. Until we examine the circumstances surrounding this impossible scream, speculation is premature." Morning found us boarding the early train to Newcastle. Holmes had already received additional information about the death at Ravencroft. "The deceased is Professor Ambrose Sellinger, an antiquarian found 2 days ago in the Abbey's chapel," Holmes explained. "The cause of death remains undetermined, though the report notes an expression of extreme terror upon his countenance. "Heart failure brought on by fright," I suggested. "Perhaps, though it would take something extraordinary to frighten a man to death, particularly one accustomed to artifacts of the dead. Selinger was studying medieval carvings in the chapel, work commissioned by Lord Blackwood. And the scream mentioned in the telegram, multiple witnesses report hearing an unearthly cry at the moment of Selinger's death, a sound that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere within the chapel. Lord Blackwood himself confirms this peculiar phenomenon. A trick of the Abbey's architecture, perhaps. Many old churches have unusual acoustic properties." Holmes nodded. "A rational suggestion, and one worth investigating. Yet it does not explain why this sound coincided with Selinger's demise, nor why it inspired such terror. By the time we changed trains at Newcastle, darkness had begun to settle over the Northumberland landscape. A carriage awaited us, its driver muffled against the biting coastal wind. I noticed Holmes studying the man with his penetrating gaze. "You've served the Blackwood family for many years," Holmes remarked as we settled into the carriage. The driver's weathered face registered. "Surprise! 37 years come Michaelmas, sir. How did you know?" "The Blackwood crest on your livery button is an older design, phased out some 20 years ago. That you still wear it suggests longevity and pride in your position. You must be Mr. Sherlock Holmes. His lordship said you'd have sharp eyes." He flicked the reins. "I'm Briggs, head coachman, and I'll tell you straight, we're all hoping you can make sense of what's happening at the Abbey. It ain't natural." "And what exactly is going on, in your estimation?" Holmes inquired. Briggs hesitated, his gaze fixed on the darkening road. "It's not my place to say, sir. His lordship will explain everything. But I will say this. I've served Ravencroft through 4 decades, and I've never heard anything like that cry. Makes a man's blood run cold, it does." With that ominous pronouncement, we fell into silence as the carriage rumbled through the gathering night, bearing us toward the mystery that awaited at Ravencroft Abbey. Chapter 2. The Lord of Ravencroft. The carriage journey continued for nearly an hour along the coastal road, winding between stark hillsides and offering occasional glimpses of the churning North Sea far below. As we rounded a final bend, Ravencroft Abbey emerged against the night sky, its silhouette stark and imposing upon the cliff's edge. The Gothic structure loomed dark against the charcoal sky, save for several windows glowing amber with lamplight, like watchful eyes peering into the darkness. "There she stands," Briggs announced with a note of pride tempered by apprehension. "Ravencroft Abbey. Been standing here since before Columbus sailed, they say." The carriage passed beneath a stone archway and into a courtyard, where Briggs drew the horses to a halt before an immense oak door studded with iron. Before we could alight, the door swung open, spilling warm light onto the frost-rimed cobblestones. A tall, severe-looking butler emerged, flanked by 2 footmen who hurried to attend to our luggage. "Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, I presume," the butler intoned. "His lordship is expecting you. Please follow me." The entrance hall of Ravencroft Abbey was cavernous, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows despite the numerous lamps and the crackling fire in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. Ancestral portraits gazed down from wood-panelled walls, their eyes seeming to follow us as we crossed the flagstone floor. The butler led us through the hall and down a corridor hung with tapestries depicting medieval hunting scenes, their colours dulled by centuries. "His lordship is in the library," the butler announced, pausing before a door of polished oak. "He has requested you join him there immediately upon your arrival." The library was a testament to generations of scholarly pursuit. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, accessible by a sliding ladder attached to brass rails. A massive desk dominated one end of the room, covered with charts and open volumes. At the opposite end, a man stood before a roaring fire, hands clasped behind his back, staring intently into the flames. "Lord Blackwood," the butler announced. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson have arrived." Lord Edmund Blackwood turned to face us. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, with a patrician face weathered by outdoor pursuits. His white hair was cropped short in military fashion, and his bearing suggested the discipline of a soldier despite his academic reputation. Most striking, however, were his eyes, intelligent and penetrating, but haunted by recent events. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, crossing the room with his hand extended. "I cannot express my gratitude adequately for your prompt response to my telegram. I fear matters have only grown more mysterious since I sent it." Holmes shook the offered hand. "Your telegram was most intriguing, Lord Blackwood. You mentioned an impossible scream, a rather unusual phrase for a man of science." "Indeed." Blackwood gestured to leather armchairs, arranged before the fire. "Please be seated. Refreshments will be brought shortly. You must be fatigued after your journey." As we settled ourselves, I observed Lord Blackwood more carefully. Though he maintained the composure expected of his station, his hands betrayed a slight tremor, and dark circles beneath his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "I apologize for the dramatic language of my telegram," Blackwood continued, "but I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I chose my words with scientific precision. What occurred in the chapel defies rational explanation, and yet as a man devoted to empiricism, I cannot accept supernatural agency." "Perhaps you might relate the events in sequence," Holmes suggested, leaning forward slightly, his keen gaze fixed upon our host. Blackwood nodded and took a deep breath. "For the past 3 months, I have employed Professor Ambrose Selinger, a noted antiquarian from Cambridge, to catalogue and study the medieval carvings in our chapel. Some are quite unique, dating to the 13th century. Professor Selinger was particularly interested in a series of stone panels depicting what he believed to be pre-Christian imagery, incorporated into ostensibly Christian scenes. A common practice during early conversion efforts, Holmes noted. Precisely. 3 days ago, while examining these carvings in the chapel's north transept, Selinger made what he described as a remarkable discovery. He was most excited but refused to elaborate until he had verified his findings. He requested privacy in the chapel to complete his work. Blackwood paused as the butler entered with a tray bearing a decanter of brandy and glasses. After the servant had departed, our host continued, his voice lowered. "That evening I was working, here in the library when I heard it, a scream of such otherworldly quality that it seemed to freeze the very air." Blackwood's face had paled at the recollection. "It was not merely loud, Mr. Holmes. It possessed a quality I cannot adequately describe, as if it emerged from some place beyond our world. Several of the servants heard it as well, from various locations throughout the Abbey. All heard the same scream? Holmes asked. Yes, though each described hearing it as if it originated from wherever they stood at that moment. I immediately rushed to the chapel where I found Selinger. Blackwood's voice faltered. He was lying before the carved panels, his face contorted in an expression of absolute terror. There was no mark upon him, no sign of violence, yet he was unmistakably dead. "And you summoned medical assistance?" I inquired. Dr. Chambers from the village attended within the hour. He could establish no clear cause of death, though he suggested heart failure, possibly induced by extreme fright. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. Was anything disturbed in the chapel? Any sign of an intruder? None whatsoever. The chapel doors were locked from within. Selinger had requested privacy for his work, as I mentioned. When we heard the scream, the housekeeper had to fetch the spare key. In the time between the scream and our entry, no one could have left the chapel unobserved. And yet someone, or something, caused Professor Selinger such terror that it stopped his heart, Holmes mused. Lord Blackwood leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Mr. Holmes, I am a rationalist. I have devoted my life to scientific inquiry. Yet since that night there have been recurrences." "Recurrences?" I echoed. "The scream has been heard twice more. Once yesterday at twilight, and again in the early hours of this morning. On both occasions the chapel was empty. The servants are speaking of an ancient curse. 2 have already left my employ, and others threaten to follow." Blackwood rubbed his temples wearily. "Were it not for my position as the largest employer in the district, I suspect I would have no staff remaining." Holmes rose abruptly and walked to one of the library windows, pulling aside the heavy drape to gaze out into the darkness. "Your family has owned Ravencroft Abbey since Elizabethan times, I believe." "Yes, acquired by my ancestor Sir William Blackwood in 1563. "And in all that time, has there been any similar occurrence? Any legend or family tale of unusual phenomena?" Blackwood hesitated, and I detected a subtle shift in his demeanour, a momentary guardedness that Holmes surely observed as well. "There are stories, as with any ancient property. Nothing I have given credence to until now." "I see," said Holmes, turning back from the window. "Lord Blackwood, I should like to examine both the chapel and Professor Selinger's quarters before retiring. The night is still young, and fresh impressions are often the most valuable." "Of course," our host replied, rising. "I shall have Graves show you to your rooms first, where you may refresh yourselves. When you are ready, I will personally escort you to the chapel." As we followed the butler from the library, Holmes whispered to me, "Did you observe Lord Blackwood's hesitation when I inquired about family legends?" "Indeed," I replied softly. "He knows more than he has shared." "Most certainly, Watson. And I suspect that before this case concludes, we shall need to unearth whatever secret history he is reluctant to divulge." Chapter 3. The Chapel of Whispers. After a brief respite in our accommodations, elegant chambers befitting the Abbey's grand history, we reconvened with Lord Blackwood in the main hall. He carried an ornate brass lamp that cast elongated shadows as we proceeded through the twisting corridors of Ravencroft. "The chapel lies at the eastern extremity of the Abbey," Blackwood explained, his voice echoing slightly in the stone passageway It is one of the few structures that survived intact from the original monastery. And it has remained essentially unchanged since medieval times? Holmes inquired. The basic structure, yes. Though each generation of my family has added embellishments. Primarily, the memorial effigies and stained glass. Blackwood paused before a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. Here we are. A large iron key turned in the ancient lock with a resonant click that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. The door swung inward with a groan of aged hinges, revealing darkness beyond the circle of our lamplight. I had the chapel sealed after this morning's incident, Blackwood said. No one has entered since. We stepped inside, and the atmosphere changed perceptibly. The air cooler, heavy with the scent of stone and beeswax candles. Our host lit several wall sconces, gradually illuminating the sacred space. The chapel was cruciform in design, with a central nave flanked by narrow aisles. Stone pillars rose to support ribbed vaulting overhead, and the walls were adorned with the carved panels that had so interested the late Professor Selinger. Where exactly was the professor found? Holmes asked, his gaze sweeping methodically around the chapel. Here, in the north transept. Blackwood led us to an area where several panels displayed particularly intricate carvings. He was lying just so, his face toward these panels. He gestured to a spot on the flagstone floor. Holmes immediately dropped to his knees, producing his magnifying lens to examine the floor. No sign of a struggle, he murmured, more to himself than to us. Not even scuff marks from sudden movement. As I mentioned, there was no violence, Blackwood confirmed. It was as if he simply expired where he stood. While Holmes continued his meticulous examination of the scene, I found myself drawn to the carved panels that had been the focus of Selinger's research. They depicted biblical scenes. I recognized the flight into Egypt and the baptism of Christ, but with curious elements that seemed out of place in Christian iconography. Grotesque faces peered from stylized foliage, and certain symbols appeared repeatedly in the borders of each panel. Fascinating, are they not? Blackwood had noticed my interest. According to Selinger, these carvings incorporate symbolism from local pagan traditions that preceded Christianity in Northumberland. The stonemasons apparently preserved older beliefs, even as they created ostensibly Christian art. Did the professor identify these symbols? I asked. He was in the process of doing so. That was part of his remarkable discovery, I believe. Holmes had risen and was now studying the carvings himself, his sharp eyes moving systematically across each panel. These symbols recur with deliberate frequency, he observed. This one in particular. He pointed to what appeared to be a spiral with an irregular outer edge. Appears in each scene, though subtly integrated into different elements. Selinger called it the vortex, Blackwood said. He believed it represented a gateway between worlds in the old pagan beliefs. A gateway, Holmes repeated thoughtfully. Interesting terminology. Lord Blackwood, you mentioned that Selinger kept notes on his research. Where might those be found? In his quarters. I've had them left undisturbed. Excellent. We shall examine them presently. Holmes turned his attention to the chapel's architecture. The acoustic properties of this space are rather unusual, are they not? The way our voices carry. Indeed, the chapel is renowned for its acoustics. During the Abbey's monastic days, a whisper at the altar could reportedly be heard clearly at the rear of the nave, a feature the abbots used to great effect during services, I'm told. Holmes walked slowly around the perimeter of the chapel, occasionally tapping the stonework or pausing to listen to some subtle quality of the space that only he perceived. When he reached the carved panels again, he stopped, his head tilted slightly. "Watson," he said suddenly, "would you be so kind as to stand at the chapel entrance and speak in a normal tone?" I complied, taking my position by the door, while Holmes remained by the carvings. "What shall I say, Holmes?" "Anything at all, my friend." "Very well. It is a cold January night, and we find ourselves investigating a most peculiar case at Ravencraftoft, Abbey in Northumberland," I recited, feeling somewhat foolish. "Fascinating," Holmes responded. "Now, remain where you are, but direct your voice toward the central altar, if you would." Again I obliged, repeating the same sentence while facing the altar. Holmes moved to different positions throughout the chapel, listening intently each time. Finally, he returned to the north transept, a look of satisfaction on his face. "Just as I suspected," he said. "Lord Blackwood, this chapel possesses what architects term a whispering gallery effect, but with an unusual variation. Sound originating in certain positions is amplified and redirected in quite remarkable ways." "Could this explain the nature of the scream that was heard?" I asked. "It may account for how a sound could seem to originate from multiple locations simultaneously," Holmes conceded. "But not for the sound itself, nor for Professor Sellinger's demise." Blackwood had been watching Holmes's exploration with keen interest. "There is something else you should see," he said, moving towards the carved panels. Sellinger's final notes mentioned a particular detail in this section. He indicated a portion of carving that appeared to depict a choir of angels surrounding a central figure. On closer inspection, however, the angels bore expressions not of divine serenity, but of anguish, their mouths open in what could be interpreted as song or screams. "Good heavens," I murmured. "Indeed," Blackwood agreed grimly. Sellinger believed this panel represented not heavenly choirs, but souls in torment. The central figure is not God or Christ, but something altogether different, what he termed the caller. Holmes examined the carving minutely through his lens. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," he observed. "These figures were carved with remarkable anatomical accuracy for the period. Note the tension in the throat muscles of these figures, consistent with the physical act of screaming." "But what does it signify?" I asked. "And what connection could it have to Sellinger's death or the screams heard in the Abbey?" "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must determine." Holmes straightened and turned to Blackwood. "I should like to examine Professor Sellinger's quarters and research materials now, if that is convenient." As we exited the chapel, Holmes lingered behind momentarily. I glanced back to see him running his fingers lightly over the edge of one of the carved panels, a peculiar expression on his face. When he noticed my observation, he quickly withdrew his hand and followed us into the corridor. "Lord Blackwood," Holmes said as our host relocked the chapel door, "has the key to this door remained in your possession since Sellinger's death?" "Yes, this is the only key currently in use. The duplicate that the housekeeper retrieved on the night of the incident has been securely stored in my study. And you're certain no one has entered the chapel since this morning? Absolutely certain, Mr. Holmes. I gave strict instructions, and my staff would not disobey me on such a matter, particularly given their current state of superstitious alarm. Very good, Holmes replied, though I detected a note in his voice. That suggested he remained unconvinced about something. Now, to the Professor's quarters. As we traversed the Abbey's corridors, I noticed Holmes repeatedly glancing back toward the chapel we had left behind, his expression thoughtful and alert, as if he expected to hear that dreadful scream at any moment. Chapter 4. The Professor's Papers. Professor Selinger had been accommodated in the west wing of the Abbey, in a spacious suite traditionally reserved for visiting scholars. The rooms consisted of a comfortable bedchamber and an adjoining study, the latter having been transformed into an impromptu research station. A large oak desk dominated the centre of the study, its surface covered with carefully arranged papers, reference books, and detailed sketches of the chapel carvings. As I mentioned, nothing has been disturbed, Lord Blackwood said as he ushered us in. Even the servants have been instructed not to clean these rooms. Holmes moved immediately to the desk, his keen eyes scanning the organized chaos of academic pursuit. Most illuminating, he murmured, lifting a sheet of paper covered with the professor's cramped handwriting. Selinger was methodical in his work. These pages are numbered and dated. He was renowned for his meticulous documentation, Blackwood confirmed. Cambridge considered him their premier medieval art historian. While Holmes examined the desk contents, I found myself drawn to a small table by the window, where several artifacts had been arranged with apparent care. Among them were rubbings taken from the chapel carvings, a collection of small stones, and what appeared to be fragments of ancient pottery. Did the professor bring these items with him, or were they discovered here at the Abbey? I inquired. The usual rubbings are his work, of course, Blackwood replied, but those stone and pottery fragments were excavated from the Abbey grounds over the years. My family has maintained a small collection of archaeological finds, which I made available to Selinger for his research. Holmes had begun organizing Selinger's papers chronologically, creating neat stacks that traced the progression of his work. Watson, would you be so kind as to read aloud from this most recent entry? He handed me several pages, dated just 2 days before the professor's death. I cleared my throat and began to read. The integration of pre-Christian symbols into the chapel carvings is more deliberate than I initially supposed. What appeared at first to be merely decorative elements now reveal themselves as a coherent system of arcane significance. The recurrence of the vortex motif in particular suggests a fixation with the concept of interdimensional transit, a gateway or passage between our world and what the ancients termed the Otherworld. Otherworld, I interjected. Rather fanciful terminology for an academic. Continue, Watson, Holmes urged, his attention now focused on a large sketchbook. Most significant is the panel depicting what appears superficially to be the heavenly host, but is, in fact, a representation of the calling, a ritual described in certain suppressed ecclesiastical texts from the early medieval period. According to these accounts, practitioners could, through specific intonations, open a temporary aperture to the otherworld. The expressions of the figures are not those of divine ecstasy, but of mortal terror. as they witness what emerges from this aperture. Did Selinger reference any specific texts? Holmes asked without looking up from the sketchbook. I scanned the pages. Yes, he mentions something called the Northumbrian Codex and the Revelations of Abbot Elred, both apparently preserved in fragmentary form in the Abbey's archive. At this, Lord Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. The Abbey does maintain a small archive of historical documents, though I was unaware Selinger had located these particular texts. Holmes glanced up sharply. You are familiar with them, then? It's reputation only, Blackwood replied, though I detected a certain guardedness in his tone. They are considered apocryphal accounts, heavily influenced by local folklore rather than proper theological doctrine. The Church never recognized them as legitimate texts. Interesting, Holmes murmured, returning to the sketchbook. He carefully turned several pages, revealing detailed drawings of the carved panels we had seen in the chapel, with particular symbols highlighted and annotated. Selinger was attempting to decipher what he believed to be instructions encoded in these carvings. Instructions. For what? I asked. For performing the calling, apparently. Holmes turned another page, revealing a drawing that made me catch my breath. It depicted the vortex symbol we had seen in the carvings, but rendered in a more explicit form. Here, it unmistakably resembled a spiralling tunnel leading to a gaping maw filled with contorted faces. Good heavens, I murmured. Indeed, Holmes replied, his expression remaining impassive, even as he studied the disturbing image. Lord Blackwood, was Professor Selinger known to have an artistic imagination, or was he strictly empirical in his documentation? Selinger was renowned for his precision, Blackwood replied. His colleagues often joked that he could make the Book of Revelation sound like a meteorological report. Holmes nodded thoughtfully and continued turning pages until he came to an abrupt stop. Most curious, he said. The final pages have been removed. Removed? Blackwood stepped closer, clearly surprised. Are you certain? Quite certain. Observe the binding. Several pages have been neatly excised with a sharp blade. Holmes pointed to the telltale remnants of paper along the inner spine of the sketchbook. The final dated entry we have is from the morning of Selinger's death, but there is evidence he made additional notes that are now missing. Do you suggest foul play, Mr. Holmes? Blackwood asked, his voice tense. And I suggest nothing at this juncture, Lord Blackwood. Merely observe an anomaly that requires explanation. Holmes closed the sketchbook and placed it carefully back on the desk. Tell me, was Professor Selinger in the habit of vocalizing his findings as he worked? The question seemed to catch our host off guard. I believe he was, yes. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, mentioned that she often heard him reading aloud to himself when she brought his tea. Reading aloud? Holmes repeated thoughtfully. In the chapel, with its unique acoustic properties. A chill ran through me as I grasped the implication of Holmes's line of questioning. Holmes, you cannot seriously suggest. My words were cut short by a sound that froze the blood in my veins. A high, keening wail that seemed to emanate from the very walls around us. It rose in pitch and intensity until it became a scream of such unearthly quality that it seemed to penetrate to the very core of one's being. Lord Blackwood went deathly pale, gripping the edge of the desk for support. "That's it," he whispered hoarsely when the sound had faded. "That's the cry." Holmes was already moving, sprinting toward the door with uncharacteristic urgency. "Come, Watson," he called over his shoulder. "To the chapel at once." We raced through the corridors of the ancient Abbey, the echo of that dreadful scream still resonating in our minds, driving us toward a mystery that grew more terrifying with each revelation. Chapter 5. The Midnight Revelation. We raced through the winding corridors of Ravencraft Abbey, following Holmes as he navigated the labyrinthine passages with surprising certainty. Lord Blackwood struggled to keep pace, his breath coming in ragged, gasps that betrayed both exertion and fear. By the time we reached the corridor leading to the chapel, we could hear voices raised in alarm. The household had awakened to the unearthly cry. "The key, Lord Blackwood," Holmes demanded, extending his hand as we reached the chapel door. Our host fumbled in his pocket, his hands trembling slightly as he produced the heavy iron key. Holmes snatched it impatiently and thrust it into the lock, turning it with a decisive click. The door swung open to reveal darkness beyond. "Stay close," Holmes instructed as we entered. The chapel felt different now, colder, with a strange quality to the air that seemed to prickle against the skin. Holmes strode directly to the north transept, where we had examined the carvings earlier. "Light, Watson," he called, and I hastened to ignite the wall sconces we had used during our previous visit. As the flames cast their uncertain light across the sacred space, I half expected to find some intruder or evidence of disturbance. Instead, the chapel appeared exactly as we had left it, silent and apparently empty. "Nothing," Lord Blackwood whispered. "Yet we all heard it." Holmes was examining the carved panels with intense focus, his magnifying glass moving methodically across the stone surfaces. "Not nothing, Lord Blackwood. Observe." He gestured to one of the panels, the one depicting the caller, surrounded by the screaming figures. Something about it seemed different, though I could not immediately identify what had changed. "The expression," Holmes said, as if reading my thoughts. "The central figure's expression has altered." "Impossible!" Blackwood exclaimed. "These carvings are solid stone, centuries old." "And yet," Holmes insisted, "compare it to Selinger's sketch." He produced from his pocket a folded page he had evidently taken from the professor's study, a detailed drawing of the same panel. In the sketch, the central figure wore an expression of stern command. In the carving before us now, the lips were parted in what could only be described as a frozen cry. "This cannot be," Blackwood said, his voice barely audible. "Stone does not change. Indeed it does not," Holmes agreed, "which suggests either a remarkable trick of light and shadow or deliberate alteration." "But we were just here earlier this evening," I protested. "And you heard Lord Blackwood. The chapel has been locked since morning, with the only key in his possession." Holmes ran his fingers lightly over the carving. "The stone is cold. No signs of recent tooling." He stepped back, scanning the entire chapel with narrowed eyes. "Lord Blackwood, you mentioned that each generation of your family has made additions to this chapel. What form did these typically take?" "The usual sort of thing: memorial tablets, improvements to the windows, restoration of damaged elements," Blackwood replied, clearly puzzled by this line of questioning. And the carvings themselves, have they ever been restored or altered? There was some work done in my grandfather's time, I believe. The dampness from the sea air had caused deterioration. He brought in Italian stonemasons to repair the worst affected sections. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. I see. And this area specifically? He gestured to the panels we were examining. I cannot say with certainty, Blackwood admitted. The records of the restoration are in the family archives, but I have never had occasion to examine them in detail. At that moment, a movement caught my eye, a flicker of shadow in the far corner of the chapel. "Holmes," I whispered, pointing. With remarkable swiftness, Holmes sprang toward the spot, disappearing momentarily into the darkness beyond the reach of our lamps. There was a brief scuffle, a muffled exclamation, and then Holmes reappeared, firmly gripping the arm of a young woman. "I believe introductions are in order," Holmes said dryly as he led the struggling figure into the light. "Miss Blackwood," Lord Blackwood exclaimed, "what in God's name are you doing here?" The young woman who stood before us could not have been more than 20 years of age. She had the same aristocratic features as Lord Blackwood, though her expression held a defiance, entirely absent from her father's demeanour. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she wore a simple black dress, more suited to a servant than the daughter of nobility. "I might ask you the same question, father," she replied with surprising composure, given the circumstances. "These midnight expeditions to the chapel can hardly be good for your health. You know perfectly well why we are here," Blackwood said tersely. "The question is how you came to be in this chapel when it has been locked since morning." A slight smile curved the young woman's lips. "The same way I have always come and gone, through the priest's door behind the altar screen. You're not the only Blackwood who knows the secrets of Ravencroft, father." Holmes released her arm, his expression betraying neither surprise nor irritation. "Miss Eleanor Blackwood, I presume. The family resemblance is most apparent." She turned to study Holmes with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "And you must be the famous Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Father's telegram suggested he was calling in extraordinary assistance." Her gaze shifted to me. "And Dr. Watson, the chronicler. Your accounts of Mr. Holmes's cases are quite thorough, if somewhat romanticized." "You have me at a disadvantage, Miss Blackwood," I admitted, somewhat taken aback by her forthright manner. "Eleanor has a regrettable habit of involving herself in matters that do not concern her," Lord Blackwood said stiffly. "She should be at Cambridge, finishing her studies." "Term doesn't resume for another week, father," she replied coolly. "And given that Professor Sellinger was my doctoral adviser, I would argue that his death very much concerns me." This revelation caused both Holmes and myself to reassess the young woman before us. Far from being a meddlesome girl, it seemed Miss Blackwood had legitimate connections to our investigation. "You were working with Sellinger on his research?" Holmes asked, his tone notably more respectful. "I was assisting him, yes." Her expression darkened. "Until 2 days ago, when he was found dead in this very spot, apparently frightened to death by nothing more substantial than sound and shadow." "Eleanor, please," her father interjected. "This is hardly appropriate conversation." "Would you prefer I pretend ignorance of what's happening here?" she challenged, like the rest of the household, trembling behind locked doors and whispering of curses. She turned back to Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, I believe I can assist your investigation. I know what Professor Selinger discovered, and why it cost him his life." Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. "In that case, Miss Blackwood, I suggest we continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable. The chapel grows cold, and some matters are better discussed by firelight than in shadow." As we prepared to depart, I noticed Holmes cast one final, searching glance at the carved panels. For a moment, I could have sworn that the faces caught in their eternal scream seemed to follow our movement, their stone eyes filled with a terrible warning. Chapter 6. The Scholar's Daughter. We reconvened in Lord Blackwood's study, a more intimate space than the grand library. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across oak-panelled walls lined with family portraits. Eleanor Blackwood sat opposite Holmes, her posture straight and composed despite the tension evident between her and her father, who stood by the mantelpiece with barely concealed agitation. "Now, Miss Blackwood," Holmes began, "you claim to have knowledge of Professor Selinger's discoveries. I would be most interested to hear what you know." Eleanor's gaze flicked briefly toward her father before she spoke. Professor Selinger came to Ravencroft ostensibly to catalogue the medieval carvings, but his true interest lay in what he called the encoded ritual hidden within them. "Eleanor," Lord Blackwood cautioned, "there are matters best left undisturbed." "A man is dead, father," she replied sharply. "Your preference for secrecy hardly matters now." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Please continue, Miss Blackwood." She nodded. "The carvings in the chapel are not merely decorative or even purely religious. They contain instructions for a ritual dating back to pre-Christian times, preserved in stone by craftsmen who maintained the old beliefs even as they outwardly converted to Christianity." "The ritual you refer to being the calling?" Holmes inquired. "Yes. Selinger found references to it in the Abbey archives, specifically in fragments of the Northumbrian Codex." She looked directly at her father. "A text that, contrary to what you told Mr. Holmes, has been studied extensively by generations of Blackwoods." Lord Blackwood flushed, but did not deny her assertion. "The Codex," Eleanor continued, "describes a ceremony by which certain individuals, those with the proper knowledge and lineage, could temporarily open what it calls the veil between worlds. The ritual required specific acoustical conditions and precise vocalizations." "And the chapel provides these acoustical conditions," Holmes observed. "Precisely. It was designed for that purpose, Mr. Holmes." The Cistercian Abbey was built upon a much older sacred site, a place where the boundary between worlds was believed to be exceptionally thin. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. "Miss Blackwood, you speak of these matters as if you give them credence. Surely, as a scholar of Cambridge, you cannot believe in such superstitions." A ghost of a smile crossed her features. "My field is comparative, mythology and early British folklore, Dr. Watson. I study beliefs. I need not share them to recognize their power and historical significance. Yet you suggested that Selinger's discovery cost him his life," Holmes prompted. "What exactly did he discover that proved so dangerous?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing again at her father, who now appeared resigned rather than resistant. "He discovered that the ritual had been performed here before, many times throughout the Abbey's history, and he learned why it was forbidden." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. The calling does not merely open a doorway, it summons something through that doorway, something that does not willingly return to its realm. Preposterous, I murmured, though the memory of that unearthly scream still chilled my blood. What her Selinger realized, she continued, ignoring my skepticism, was that the panels in the North Transept don't merely depict the ritual. They record an instance when it went catastrophically wrong. The central figure, the caller, lost control of whatever emerged. The surrounding figures aren't worshippers, but victims. Holmes remained impassive, though I knew him well enough to sense his intense concentration. And the significance of this discovery? The significance, Mr. Holmes, is that the Blackwood family has known this history for centuries and has taken great pains to conceal it. Her gaze fixed accusingly on her father, even to the point of removing certain pages from family histories and restricting access to parts of the archive. Lord Blackwood finally spoke, his voice weary. Every family has its secrets, Mr. Holmes. Some are kept not out of shame, but out of duty, to protect others from dangerous knowledge. Yet Professor Selinger uncovered this knowledge, Holmes observed, and now he is dead under mysterious circumstances. You cannot possibly suggest that I— Blackwood began heatedly. I suggest nothing, Lord Blackwood. I merely observe connections. Holmes turned back to Eleanor. You believe Selinger attempted the ritual himself? I believe he reconstructed it from his research, she replied carefully. He was fascinated by the acoustic aspects, the way certain sounds would resonate within the chapel's architecture. He spoke of harmonic frequencies that could affect the physical properties of stone over time. Stone does not change, Miss Blackwood, I pointed out. Stone does not change quickly, Dr. Watson, she corrected, but sound waves can affect matter in subtle ways over extended periods. Cathedral pillars vibrate with certain organ notes. Glass shatters at specific pitches. Selinger believed the chapel was designed as an acoustic instrument, one that, when played correctly, could produce effects beyond our conventional understanding. And he attempted to play this instrument, Holmes concluded. Yes. The night before his death, he told me he had deciphered the precise sequence of vocalizations described in the carvings. He was going to test his theory the following day. Her voice faltered slightly. I urged him to wait until I returned from the village with additional references, but he was too eager to proceed. And what of the missing pages from his notebook? Holmes asked. Do you know what became of them? I removed them, she admitted without hesitation. After his death, before the local authorities arrived. I feared they contained information too dangerous to leave unguarded. You have them still? Of course. She reached into a pocket concealed in the folds of her dress and withdrew several folded sheets of paper. I intended to destroy them, but something held me back. Perhaps the scholar in me couldn't bear to erase knowledge, however perilous. Holmes accepted the pages, unfolding them carefully. The topmost sheet contained a series of phonetic notations, strange combinations of syllables arranged in spiraling patterns across the page. Below these were musical notations interspersed with what appeared to be breathing instructions. Most interesting, Holmes murmured. This appears to be a systematized approach to producing specific vocal resonances. It is the ritual of the calling, Eleanor confirmed. Or rather, Selinger's reconstruction of it. I believe he performed this sequence in the chapel, standing before the carved panels, and something answered. The scream, I suggested, or Selinger's own cry of terror at what he witnessed. Holmes countered, his expression thoughtful. You mentioned this ritual had been performed before at Ravencroft. What occurred on those occasions? Lord Blackwood stirred uneasily. There are family accounts, private journals and letters that describe attempts spanning back to the 16th century. None ended well for the practitioner. Yet the practice persisted, Holmes noted. Human curiosity is a powerful force, Mr. Holmes, Blackwood replied grimly, particularly when coupled with the promise of forbidden knowledge. Or power, Eleanor added. Some accounts suggest that whatever lies beyond the veil can be bound to service if the caller is sufficiently skilled or sufficiently ruthless. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind had risen, moaning around the ancient stones of Ravencroft like a restless spirit. I found myself glancing towards the darkened windows, half expecting to see some face peering in from the night. There is something else you should know, Eleanor said finally. The scream. It's not merely a sound of terror or warning. According to the Codex, it's the voice of the summoned entity. And each time it's heard, the boundary between worlds grows thinner. You suggest we are in danger, Holmes said. I suggest, Mr. Holmes, that whatever Professor Selinger called through that ancient doorway has not departed, and worse, it now knows the way. Chapter 7. The Midnight Vigil. Heavy silence followed Eleanor's ominous pronouncement. Holmes sat with fingers steepled beneath his chin, his penetrating gaze fixed on the pages from Selinger's notebook. Outside, the wind had increased to a gale, its mournful keening around the ancient stones of Ravencroft providing an eerie counterpoint to our conversation. Miss Blackwood, Holmes said at length, you've presented a most extraordinary narrative. However, I have found throughout my career that the most fantastical explanations, while appealing to the imagination, rarely withstand scrutiny when compared to more prosaic alternatives. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. You believe I've fabricated this account, Mr. Holmes? Not at all. I believe you are relating the information as you understand it. But I must consider all possibilities, including the prospect that Professor Selinger's death and these subsequent phenomena have more mundane origins. Such as, Lord Blackwood asked, a hint of challenge in his voice. A clever antagonist with knowledge of acoustics and access to the chapel could orchestrate effects designed to terrify. The human mind, when primed by suggestion and folklore, is remarkably susceptible to interpretation of natural phenomena as supernatural. Holmes rose and paced slowly before the fire. What better foundation for deception than ancient superstition and architectural peculiarities? I nodded agreement, relieved to hear Holmes assert a rational framework. Holmes has exposed numerous instances of seemingly supernatural occurrences that proved to be elaborate deceptions, I added. Eleanor was unmoved. And what would be the purpose of such a deception at Ravencroft? Who benefits from terrorizing the household or causing Professor Selinger's death? That remains to be established, Holmes conceded. But I find it more plausible than doorways to other worlds. Yet you cannot explain the changing expression on the carving, Eleanor countered. or how the scream could be heard simultaneously throughout the Abbey. The former may be a trick of light and shadow, or perhaps subtle manipulation of the stone itself. The latter, as we've established, is a function of the chapel's unusual acoustic properties. Holmes paused in his pacing. What interests me more immediately is determining whether Professor Sellinger's death was a natural consequence of terror, as the local doctor suggested, or something more sinister. "You suspect foul play?" Lord Blackwood asked sharply. "I suspend judgment until I have sufficient data, which brings me to my next course of action." Holmes consulted his pocket watch. "It is now 1:30. I propose to spend the remainder of the night in the chapel, observing directly any phenomena that might occur." "Alone?" I asked with some alarm. "Not at all, my dear Watson. I count on your company, as always." Holmes's lips curved in a slight smile. "Your medical expertise may prove invaluable should we encounter anything that affects the human nervous system." "I'm coming as well," Eleanor declared firmly. "Eleanor, I forbid it," her father interjected. "It's far too dangerous." "I understand the ritual better than anyone here," she countered. "If something does occur, my knowledge could be crucial." Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. "Miss Blackwood's expertise would indeed be valuable, Lord Blackwood, and I assure you we shall take every precaution for her safety." The nobleman hesitated, clearly torn between concern for his daughter and recognition of Holmes's reasoning. "Very well," he conceded finally, "but I shall accompany you all. Ravencroft is my responsibility after all." Holmes nodded. "Excellent. I suggest we gather what we might need for a night's vigil. Watson, your medical bag might be prudent. Lord Blackwood, perhaps writing materials to record any observations, and additional lamps. And these," Eleanor added, moving to a bookshelf and extracting a slim volume bound in faded leather. "My own notes on the Northumbrian Codex. They may help us interpret anything we observe." We separated briefly to collect the necessary items. In my room, as I packed my medical bag, I found myself staring at my revolver, debating whether to bring it. Against the superstitious accounts of ancient entities, a firearm seemed laughably inadequate. Yet, if Holmes was correct, and we faced human agency rather than supernatural forces, it might prove essential. I tucked it into my coat pocket. We reconvened in the main hall, where Holmes was engaged in quiet conversation with one of the footmen. As I approached, the servant nodded and withdrew. "I've arranged for hot coffee to be brought to the chapel antechamber periodically," Holmes explained. "A cold vigil is unpleasant enough without the additional discomfort of drowsiness." "You anticipate a lengthy observation, then?" I asked. "Until dawn, at minimum. Ghostly manifestations traditionally favour the hours approaching daybreak, do they not?" There was a glint of humour in his eyes, though his expression remained serious. More practically, if there is human agency involved, fatigue and impatience may drive our antagonist to act as the night progresses. Our small party made its way through the silent abbey. The wind's howl muffled by thick stone walls. The corridors were dimly lit and seemed longer than I remembered from our earlier traversals. When we finally reached the chapel door, Lord Blackwood produced the key with noticeable reluctance. "Once more unto the breach," Holmes murmured as the heavy door swung open on protesting hinges. The chapel interior was dramatically transformed by night. Our lamplight created shifting patterns across the stone floor and walls, causing the carved figures to appear almost animated in the flickering illumination. The wind's voice, channeled through some quirk of the building's construction, produced an effect not unlike distant choral singing, sometimes rising to a keening wail, then subsiding to a low murmur. "Remarkable acoustics," Holmes commented, his voice carrying clearly despite his soft tone. "Even the wind becomes an instrument when played through these ancient stones." We established our posts in the north transept, where the carved panels depicting the caller and his victims dominated the wall. Holmes arranged additional lamps to ensure consistent illumination of the carvings, eliminating the possibility of shadow play causing illusory changes to the expressions. "Now," he said, settling onto a stone bench with a clear view of both the panels and the chapel's main entrance, "we wait and observe. I suggest we maintain periods of complete silence to better detect any unusual sounds." Lord Blackwood positioned, himself near his daughter, his expression betraying a mixture of scepticism and apprehension. Eleanor sat with her notebook open, occasionally making notations as she studied the carved panels with scholarly intensity. Hours passed with little to mark them save the gradual shifting of shadows as our lamps burned lower, and the periodic visits from the footman with fresh coffee. Holmes maintained his vigilance with characteristic focus, his keen gaze systematically scanning the chapel at regular intervals. I found myself fighting drowsiness despite the coffee, the adrenaline of our earlier excitement having long since dissipated. It was during one such moment of heavy-lidded fatigue as the night crept toward its darkest hour that I first noticed the change in the air, a subtle pressure against the eardrums, similar to the sensation one experiences at high altitude. Holmes straightened almost imperceptibly, a sign that he too had detected the alteration. "Listen," Eleanor whispered. Beneath the wind's constant moan, another sound had emerged, a low rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. It was not so much heard as felt, a pulsation that resonated in the bones and cavities of the body. "The chapel is singing," she said. Chapter 8. The Caller's Voice. The vibration intensified gradually, rising from a subtle tremor to a distinct resonance that caused the lamplight to flicker. Holmes moved swiftly to the nearest carved panel, placing his palm flat against the stone surface. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The stone is vibrating at a consistent frequency." His eyes narrowed as he glanced towards the vaulted ceiling. "Is there any mechanism within the chapel structure that might produce such an effect? Hidden pipes, perhaps? Or chambers designed to channel air?" "Not to my knowledge," Lord Blackwood replied, his voice tight with tension, "though the Abbey has been modified many times over the centuries." Eleanor had risen to her feet, her attention fixed on the carving of the caller. "Mr. Holmes," she said urgently, "observe the central figure." We all turned to look. In the wavering lamplight, the carved face seemed to shift subtly, the stone lips appearing to move as if forming words. I blinked hard, certain it must be an Eowado. Illusion caused by the unsteady light and my own fatigue. Yet when I looked again, the impression remained. A clever trick of illumination," Holmes declared, though I detected a rare note of uncertainty in his voice. He moved one of the lamps, changing the angle of light on the carving. The apparent movement continued unaffected. "It's responding to the vibrations," Eleanor said, consulting her notes. "The Codex mentions this. Certain frequencies can activate properties within specially prepared stone. The elements sleep until awakened by the Master's voice." The vibration had now become a distinct hum that filled the chapel, modulating in pitch and intensity like some vast, invisible instrument being played. I felt a growing pressure in my head, not painful but disorienting, as if my senses were being subjected to stimuli beyond their normal range. "Watson," Holmes said sharply, "are you unwell?" I realized I had staggered slightly. "A momentary disorientation," I assured him. "The acoustics are quite affecting." "Indeed." Holmes consulted his pocket watch. "Nearly 3 o'clock, the so-called witching hour. If our adversary is staging these effects, they have a theatrical sense of timing." The humming suddenly ceased, leaving a silence so profound it seemed almost solid. In that silence we all heard it, a whisper that came from nowhere and everywhere, words in a language I did not recognize, yet somehow understood on some primal level. "Ancient Northumbrian," Eleanor whispered, her face pale. "A dialect that predates written records. What does it say?" Holmes demanded, his skepticism momentarily set aside in favor of gathering data. "It speaks of opening, of hunger, of returning." She swallowed hard. "It's answering the call that Selinger initiated." Lord Blackwood moved closer to his daughter, his expression a mixture of fear and protectiveness. "We should leave this place," he urged. "Whatever is happening, we are unprepared to confront it." Holmes shook his head. To retreat now would be to abandon any hope of uncovering the truth. Besides, the phenomenon appears to be localized to the chapel. If there is danger, better to face it directly than be pursued through the Abbey corridors. As if in response to his words, the whispering intensified, becoming a susurration like dry leaves blown across stone. The temperature in the chapel plummeted, our breath suddenly visible in the cold air. The lamps flickered more violently, casting wild shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. "Look!" Eleanor pointed to the floor before the carved panels. A fine dust was rising from between the flagstones, swirling in patterns too deliberate to be random. Concentric circles forming a spiral that mirrored the vortex symbol prevalent in the carvings. The dust moved against the air currents, defying natural explanation. Holmes stepped forward to examine this new phenomenon, his scientific curiosity evidently overcoming any reservations. As he approached the forming pattern, the whispering ceased, abruptly, replaced by a single clear voice that seemed to emanate from the central carving itself. "Audientes sed non intelligentes," it intoned in what I recognized as Latin. "Hearing but not understanding." Holmes froze mid-step. "Interesting," he said, his voice deliberately calm. "A direct communication in a language known to be employed in medieval Christian rites. Our mysterious entity appears well versed in ecclesiastical history." "It's not the entity speaking," Eleanor said, her eyes wide with realization. "It's Selinger. That's his voice." "Impossible," Lord Blackwood objected. "Selinger is dead." "And yet," Holmes mused, "the voice does possess distinct characteristics that could be matched to a specific individual. Watson, you have some experience with phonographic recordings." Would you say this sound could be produced by such a device? Before I could respond, the voice spoke again, this time in English. The gateway opens. What was summoned must return, but it will not go alone. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the chapel's dropped temperature. The voice, whether Selinger's or some uncanny imitation, held a quality of distance and hollowness, as if calling from the bottom of a deep well. Holmes had continued his approach toward the spiral pattern, his methodical mind clearly cataloguing every detail of the phenomenon. "A most elaborate deception," he muttered. "The acoustics, the vibrations in the stone, this dust formation, all ingeniously orchestrated to create the impression of supernatural agency." "Mr. Holmes," Eleanor called urgently, "I don't believe this is deception. The pattern forming on the floor, it's an exact match for the interdimensional gateway described in the Codex." The dust spiral had continued to expand and now encompassed a diameter of perhaps 6 feet. It centered directly before the carved panel depicting the caller. The air above it appeared distorted, like heat shimmer above a summer road, though the chapel remained bitterly cold. "Stand back, Holmes," I urged, my hand moving instinctively to the revolver in my pocket. Whatever this is, my warning was cut short as the spiral pattern suddenly illuminated from within. A pale blue luminescence that cast eerie shadows across the chapel walls. The carved faces of the victims surrounding the caller were thrown into stark relief, their expressions of terror now seeming horribly appropriate. "Fascinating," Holmes breathed, his scientific detachment momentarily overtaking his caution. He knelt at the edge of the glowing spiral, examining the phenomenon with intense focus. "The dust appears to be a phosphorescent compound, activated perhaps by the vibrations we felt earlier." "Holmes, please!" I took a step forward, but found myself suddenly unable to move closer, as if some invisible barrier had formed around the spiral. The voice spoke once more, urgency now evident in its hollow tones. "It comes. What was called must answer. The price must be paid." The blue glow intensified, pulsing in rhythm with the returning vibration in the stone. At the center of the spiral, the air began to twist and fold upon itself, forming what appeared to be a deepening tunnel of light that extended downward through the solid floor. Holmes had risen to his feet, but remained at the edge of the phenomenon, his expression now showing the first signs of genuine concern. "Most extraordinary," he said quietly. "The optical effect is quite convincing." "It's not an effect," Eleanor whispered, clutching her father's arm. "The veil is thinning, just as the Codex warned." "The veil between worlds," Lord Blackwood added, his voice barely audible. "God help us all." From the depths of the luminous tunnel came a sound, faint at first, then growing stronger. A keening wail that raised the hairs on the back of my neck and set my teeth on edge. The same unearthly cry we had heard before, but now with a quality of approach, as if whatever produced it was drawing nearer with each passing moment. Holmes backed away from the edge of the spiral, his face illuminated by the pulsing blue light. For the first time since I had known him, I saw in his eyes something I had never witnessed before, the first glimmer of doubt in his purely rational world-view. "Watson," he said quietly, "I believe we may need to reconsider our hypotheses." Chapter 9. Between Two Worlds. The unearthly cry grew louder, reverberating through the chapel with such intensity that I feared the ancient stone might crack under its force. The luminous vortex pulsed in rhythm with the sound, expanding and contracting, like some ghastly breathing thing. Holmes had retreated to stand beside me, his face lit by the cold blue light, his expression a mixture of scientific fascination and growing concern. "If this is deception," he said quietly, "it is beyond any I have encountered in my career." "It is no deception, Mr. Holmes," Eleanor insisted. "The gateway has opened. What Sellinger began is now completing itself." Lord Blackwood had drawn his daughter protectively behind him, his aristocratic composure giving way to naked fear. "We must leave immediately," he insisted. "The chapel is no longer safe." Holmes shook his head. "I fear retreating now may be more dangerous than remaining. Whatever is occurring, it appears to be centered on this location. To flee might merely spread the effect throughout the Abbey." As if to confirm his assessment, the chapel door suddenly slammed shut with a thunderous boom that momentarily drowned out even the keening wail from the vortex. A collective gasp escaped our small group as we realized we were now sealed within. "The priest's door," Eleanor suggested urgently, "behind the altar screen." "I think not, Miss Blackwood," Holmes replied, pointing toward the altar. The blue luminescence had spread, forming tendrils of light that crept along the stone floor and walls, one of which had already encircled the altar area. "We appear to be contained for the duration of this phenomenon." The wailing cry abruptly ceased, leaving an oppressive silence broken only by our ragged breathing. The vortex continued to pulse, its centre now a depthless well of swirling blue-white light. From this nadir emerged a sound I can only describe as words spoken backwards, comprehensible syllables rendered alien by their reversed sequence. "It's trying to communicate," Eleanor whispered, her scholarly instincts apparently overriding her fear. "The entity exists outside our temporal framework. It experiences language differently. A fascinating hypothesis," Holmes remarked, though one that presupposes the existence of such entities to begin with. Despite his continued skepticism, I noticed that Holmes had positioned himself between our group and the vortex, a protective stance that belied his outward calm. He removed his watch from his waistcoat and held it toward the phenomenon. "Observe," he said. "The second hand has stopped, though the mechanism continues to function. I can feel it ticking." I glanced at my own timepiece and found it similarly affected, frozen at precisely 3:33. Though I could feel it vibrating in my palm. "Time distortion," Eleanor breathed. "Just as the Codex described, when the veil parts, moments become stretched like thread upon a loom." The reversed speech grew louder, more insistent, taking on modulations that suggested urgency or demand. The blue light pulsed more rapidly, and the air in the chapel became charged with what felt like electrical potential, raising the hairs on my arms and neck. "It's seeking a response," Eleanor said, consulting her notes with trembling hands. "According to the Codex, the caller must answer when addressed, or the entity may manifest more fully." "And that would be undesirable?" Holmes inquired, his scientific detachment somehow remaining intact, despite the increasingly outlandish situation. "Catastrophic," Lord Blackwood interjected grimly. "Family records suggest the last full manifestation in 1738 resulted in 7 deaths, and structural damage to the east wing that took decades to repair. Holmes raised an eyebrow at this casual confirmation of previous occurrences, but remained focused on the immediate situation. If communication is required, how does one proceed? I assume there are protocols described in your sources. Eleanor nodded. The caller must use the response phrases carved into the panels. The specific sequence depends on the entity's approach. And how does one determine that? I asked. By the nature of its cry, she replied. The codex identifies 3 distinct patterns, each requiring a different response. The reversed speech suddenly shifted, becoming a series of staccato utterances that caused the vortex to flare with each syllable. Within the swirling light, a darkness began to form, a silhouette that seemed to reach toward us from unimaginable distance. That would be pattern 2, Eleanor said with remarkable composure given the circumstances. The response must be spoken by someone standing at the exact position where Professor Selinger died. All eyes turned to Holmes, who nodded once. Very well. I shall attempt this communication. What must I say? Eleanor directed him to a specific section of the carved panel, where a series of symbols were arranged in a circular pattern. These syllables, in sequence from innermost to outermost. They must be spoken with descending pitch. Holmes studied the carvings, his quick mind apparently memorizing the required sequence. He moved deliberately toward the spot where Selinger had been found, positioning himself precisely between the carved panels and the pulsing vortex. Holmes, I strongly advise against this, I protested. We have no assurance that these protocols will protect you. We have little choice, Watson, he replied calmly. If Miss Blackwood's interpretation is correct, failure to respond appropriately may result in consequences far worse than whatever risk I now undertake. Before I could object further, the silhouette within the vortex surged forward, its outline becoming more defined with each moment. A shape that seemed simultaneously humanoid and yet fundamentally wrong in its proportions and movement. Holmes drew himself up to his full height, facing this apparition with the same unflinching courage I had seen him display when confronting the most dangerous of human adversaries. He began to speak the syllables indicated on the carving, his rich baritone dropping in pitch with each utterance. The sounds were like no language I had ever heard, guttural and resonant, seeming to vibrate the very air around them. As the final syllable left his lips, the vortex flared blindingly bright, then contracted violently. The silhouette within it appeared to recoil, its edges blurring as if viewed through disturbed water. The reversed speech returned, now in a lower register, that somehow conveyed reluctant acknowledgement. "It's working," Eleanor whispered. "The entity recognizes the response." The blue light began to recede from the walls and floor, drawing back toward the central vortex like an ebbing tide. The oppressive atmosphere in the chapel lightened perceptibly, and I found myself able to breathe more easily. "The protocol appears effective," Holmes observed, though he remained rooted to his position. "What follows now, Miss Blackwood?" Before she could answer, the entity emitted a sound that cut through the chapel like a physical force. Not the scream we had heard before, but a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate within my very bones. The vortex pulsed once more, and then to my astonishment, began to speak. Not in backward speech, but in perfectly comprehensible English, though with cadences and emphasis that no human throat could produce. "The boundary thins," it intoned. "What was separated seeks reunion. The gateway, once opened, remembers its purpose." Holmes, to his immense credit, responded with perfect composure. "What purpose does this gateway serve?" The entity's silhouette wavered, as if the question had disturbed its cohesion. "To fulfill the covenant. The price must be paid. A life for passage." "A life was already taken," Holmes replied evenly. "Professor Selinger died before this gateway." "Insufficient," the entity responded, its tone dropping to a bone-chilling register. The caller surrendered to fear. "The true price remains unpaid." The silhouette surged forward suddenly, extending what appeared to be a limb toward Holmes. Though it remained contained within the vortex, the gesture carried unmistakable menace. "The Blackwood bloodline opened the way. The Blackwood bloodline must pay the price." At these words, Lord Blackwood stepped forward, his face ashen but resolute. "Take me then," he declared. "I am the head of the Blackwood line. If blood is required, let it be mine." "Father, no!" Eleanor cried, reaching for him. But before Lord Blackwood could approach the vortex, Holmes raised his hand in a gesture of command that stopped him in his tracks. "I think not," Holmes said, his voice ringing with authority as he addressed the entity. "No price will be paid this night. Your covenant was not with this generation, and your claim has no validity in this time." The silhouette writhed within the vortex, its form becoming increasingly agitated. "Denial is futile. What was begun must be completed." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, his eyes narrowing. "And what was begun incorrectly must be corrected." With that cryptic statement, he turned to face the carved panels directly, raised his hand to the central figure of the caller, and pressed his palm against the stone mouth. Chapter 10. The Stone's Secret. The moment Holmes's palm connected with the carved stone mouth, a tremor ran through the chapel. The blue luminescence of the vortex flickered, its rhythm disrupted. The entity's silhouette wavered, becoming less distinct. "Holmes!" I called out in alarm, certain he had placed himself in grave danger. But my friend remained steady. His eyes closed in concentration, fingers splayed across the stone face. A faint glow emanated from beneath his hand, as if the stone itself were responding to his touch. "The resonance pattern," Eleanor whispered. "He's disrupting it." "The stone isn't merely decorative," she explained to her bewildered father. "It's an instrument, a focal point for acoustic energy. Mr. Holmes has positioned his hand to dampen its resonant frequency." The vibration throughout the chapel became discordant. The entity emitted a sound of unmistakable distress, a warbling cry that set my teeth on edge. "Clever, mortal," it intoned, its voice fluctuating, "but insufficient. The gateway remembers." Holmes opened his eyes. "Watson," he called, "your medical bag, quickly!" I retrieved it, hurrying to Holmes's side despite the waves of cold emanating from the vortex. "My stethoscope," Holmes instructed. "Place the bell against the stone here, and the earpieces against the carving's ears." The request seemed bizarre, but I trusted Holmes's methods. The effect was immediate and astonishing. The stethoscope created a feedback loop between the carving's mouth and ears. A high-pitched whine emerged, cutting through the entity's utterances. The instrument is disrupting the acoustic properties, Holmes explained. Every resonant object has its breaking point, the frequency at which its structural integrity fails. The vortex pulsed erratically, its edges fraying like torn fabric. The entity's form grew distorted, its speech deteriorating into disjointed syllables. "Miss Blackwood," Holmes called, "the ritual of dismissal. Does the Codex describe such a procedure?" Eleanor consulted her notes. "Yes. When a calling goes awry, the gateway must be sealed with a specific counter-sequence." She began reciting syllables that mirrored Holmes's earlier utterances, but in reverse order and with ascending pitch. Holmes adjusted the pressure against the carving, modulating the feedback from the stethoscope. With each syllable Eleanor spoke, the vortex contracted further. The entity's form grew increasingly insubstantial, its protests fading. "The gateway is collapsing," Holmes observed, "but something is still anchoring it to this side. There must be a physical focus beyond the carvings." As if responding to his deduction, the entity made one final lunge toward the edge of the shrinking vortex. A single appendage extended beyond the blue light, reaching not toward us, but toward the floor beneath the carved panel. "There!" Holmes exclaimed. "Watson! The floor stone! It's loose!" I dropped to my knees, examining the flagstone. It shifted under pressure, its edges not flush with surrounding stones. I managed to lift the heavy slab. Beneath lay a small cavity containing a cloth-wrapped bundle. The entity emitted a sound of rage as I lifted it out, the fabric disintegrating to reveal a cylindrical object, a roll of parchment encased in a tarnished silver tube. "The anchor," Eleanor gasped, "a physical link between worlds, likely inscribed with binding symbols." "Selinger must have discovered it and partially activated the gateway," Holmes noted, "but fled in terror before completing the ritual. The entity has been striving to finish the process ever since." The vortex had contracted to barely a foot in diameter. Its light faded to a pale glow. "Complete the dismissal," Holmes instructed. Eleanor recited the final syllables of the counter-sequence. The last sound left her lips. Holmes removed the stethoscope. The vortex collapsed with a soft implosion, leaving only a fading after-image. The chapel plunged into near darkness, our lamps having burned low. In the sudden quiet, our ragged breathing seemed unnaturally loud. "Is it gone?" Lord Blackwood ventured. "The immediate manifestation appears to have been dispelled," Holmes replied cautiously, "though I suspect the potential for recurrence remains so long as this exists." He indicated the silver tube. Eleanor examined it with scholarly precision. "This is ancient, pre-Norman, possibly Saxon. The designs correspond to symbols in the Codex. A deliberate creation," Holmes observed, "hidden beneath the chapel floor during the Abbey's construction." "But by whom?" I asked, "and to what purpose?" "Those are the questions we must now address," Holmes replied. "But perhaps not at this hour." He glanced at his watch, which had resumed its normal function. "Nearly 5 o'clock. Dawn approaches." A faint greyish light had begun to filter through the stained glass windows, bringing with it a palpable sense of relief. The oppressive atmosphere had dissipated. replaced by the ordinary chill of a January morning. As we prepared to leave, Holmes lingered before the carved panels, his expression thoughtful. "Something still troubles you?" I inquired. "Several things, Watson. The stone has reverted to its original form, the expression once again one of command rather than a scream. Yet we all witnessed it change, and this," he indicated the silver tube, "raises far more questions than it answers." "You believe there's more to this mystery than what we've witnessed tonight?" Holmes's lips curved in a small, grim smile. "I believe, my dear Watson, that we have merely scratched the surface of a much deeper enigma, one that spans centuries and involves the Blackwood family in ways they themselves may not fully comprehend." He cast one final glance around the chapel. "The immediate danger appears to have passed, but our investigation is far from complete. The game is still afoot." As we stepped into the corridor, the first rays of sunrise were breaking over the distant horizon. Their golden light seemed to chase away the last vestiges of the night's uncanny events. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, not merely in the chapel, but in Holmes himself. For the first time in our long association, my friend had encountered phenomena that challenged the very foundations of his rational worldview. How he would reconcile this experience with his unwavering commitment to logic remained to be seen. But of one thing I was certain. Sherlock Holmes would not rest until he had unravelled every thread of the mystery that had brought that unearthly cry to Ravencroft Abbey. Chapter 11. Family Secrets. Dawn had fully broken by the time our exhausted party gathered in Lord Blackwood's library. A servant had stoked the fire to a cheerful blaze that dispelled both the morning chill and the lingering sense of otherworldly dread that had followed us from the chapel. Fresh coffee steamed in a silver pot on a side table, its rich aroma a welcome anchor to normality after the night's extraordinary events. Holmes sat in a leather armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin as he observed Eleanor carefully, unwrapping the silver tube we had discovered. Lord Blackwood paced near the windows, his aristocratic features lined with fatigue and troubled thoughts. "This artifact must be at least 1,000 years old," Eleanor remarked, turning the tarnished cylinder carefully in the morning light. "The craftsmanship suggests Anglo-Saxon origin, though some of the symbols appear to be even older. Possibly Celtic or Pictish." "Can you open it?" Holmes inquired. "I believe so." She examined the cap at one end of the tube, which was sealed with an intricate design reminiscent of the vortex symbol from the chapel carvings. "There appears to be a mechanism here, not simply threaded, but requiring a specific pattern of pressure." After several careful attempts, there was a faint click and the cap loosened. Eleanor carefully extracted a roll of parchment from within, so fragile it threatened to crumble at her touch. "Extraordinary," she breathed. "The preservation is remarkable. The tube must have been hermetically sealed. This is vellum of the finest quality, likely prepared from unborn calf skin." "Rather grim materials for such a document," I observed. "Appropriate, given its apparent purpose," Holmes noted dryly. With painstaking care, Eleanor unrolled a small section of the parchment on the desk, weighting its edges with small leather-bound books to prevent it from curling. The document was covered in spidery writing, some in Latin, but much of it in what appeared to be an earlier script that I did not recognize. Old English, interspersed with runic characters, Eleanor explained, seeing my puzzled expression. And something else. This section appears to be in a form of cipher or encoded language. Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes scanning the ancient text. Most intriguing. The document appears to be a contract of sorts. Observe the formal structure, and what seems to be a signature area at the bottom, though no names are immediately visible. Lord Blackwood had ceased his pacing, and now stood rigidly by the desk, his expression guarded as he watched Eleanor's examination of the parchment. I noticed a tightness around his mouth that suggested more than ordinary concern. "You recognize this document, Lord Blackwood?" Holmes asked quietly, his observant gaze missing nothing. Our host hesitated before responding. "Not this specific document, no, but family law speaks of a covenant established by my ancestors when they acquired the Abbey lands." "A covenant with whom?" I asked. The nobleman's gaze flickered to the window, where the North Sea was visible in the distance, grey and forbidding in the winter light. The traditional account suggests it was with God and his church, an obligation to maintain certain religious observances in exchange for the property. But there have always been darker interpretations. "The Codex suggests a different sort of covenant entirely," Eleanor interjected, her scholarly detachment giving way to excitement as she carefully translated sections of the document. "This appears to be an agreement between one Elfric of Ravencroft, presumably an ancestor, and an entity referred to only as the Dweller in the Depths." "What are the terms of this agreement?" Holmes asked, his tone conversational, despite the extraordinary subject matter. Eleanor's brow furrowed as she deciphered more of the text. "It's complex, but the essence appears to be an exchange of knowledge for access. The entity would provide insights beyond mortal understanding, while Elfric would maintain a doorway through which the entity could periodically observe our world, observe or enter," Holmes pressed. "The distinction seems deliberately ambiguous," she admitted, "but there are safeguards specified. The doorway was to be opened only at specific times, under specific conditions, and always under the control of the Ravencroft bloodline." Lord Blackwood had grown increasingly pale during this exchange. "The family motto," he said quietly, "Custodes Portae, keepers of the gate. I always assumed it referred to the Abbey's position guarding the coastal approach." "A convenient interpretation," Holmes observed, "though perhaps not the original intent." He turned to Eleanor. "Does the document specify the duration of this covenant?" She scanned further along the text. "Yes, it binds Elfric and his descendants unto the 13th generation." At this, Lord Blackwood sank heavily into a chair. "The 13th generation," he echoed hollowly. "I am the 12th Lord of Ravencroft since Elfric." A heavy silence followed this revelation. The implications were clear. If the covenant was real, Lord Blackwood's heir would represent the final generation bound by its terms. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice barely audible, "you are my only child." The young woman's scholarly composure faltered momentarily as the personal significance of the ancient document struck her. "The final keeper of the gate," she murmured. Holmes rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the winter landscape. "A fascinating genealogical coincidence," he remarked. though it presupposes the validity of a document that purports to establish communication with otherworldly entities, a premise that remains at best questionable. After what we witnessed in the chapel, can you still doubt? Lord Blackwood asked incredulously. I doubt nothing, and I question everything, Holmes replied. We experienced remarkable phenomena, certainly, but their cause remains to be definitively established. He turned back to face the room. Tell me, when did Professor Salinger first arrive at Ravencroft? The abrupt change of subject momentarily confused our host. Approximately 3 months ago, as I mentioned previously. And during that time, did he express any interest in your family history, beyond the academic study of the chapel carvings? He did make inquiries about the Abbey. Archives, Lord Blackwood acknowledged, and I granted him access, though certain family documents remained restricted. Including any mention of this covenant, I presume? Absolutely. Such matters are not for public knowledge. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Yet he managed to piece together enough information to attempt the ritual described in the carvings. Most resourceful of him. He was a brilliant scholar, Eleanor said, and he had access to the codex, which contains oblique references to the covenant. Indeed. Holmes returned to his seat. Let us consider, then, what we know with certainty. Professor Salinger discovered enough about the ritual to attempt it with fatal consequences. Subsequently, the phenomena continued, suggesting either that he had partially succeeded in opening this doorway, or that someone else continued his work, but who would... I began, only to be interrupted by a sharp knock at the library door. The butler entered, his customary dignity somewhat undermined by his obvious agitation. My lord, forgive the intrusion, but there's a matter requiring your immediate attention. The constable has arrived from the village with distressing news. Lord Blackwood rose wearily. Show him in, Graves. The constable who entered was a robust man with a weathered face and the practical air of one accustomed to dealing with mundane rural crimes rather than eldritch mysteries. He removed his hat respectfully, but wasted no time on pleasantries. My lord, there's been another death, he announced grimly. Young Thomas Becker, one of your groundskeepers, found this morning at the base of the cliff below the east wing. And, sir? He hesitated, glancing uncomfortably at Eleanor. Speak freely, constable, Lord Blackwood instructed. The lad's face, sir, just like the professor's, a look of pure terror. And there's something else. The constable swallowed hard. Several villagers reported hearing that same ungodly scream just before dawn. Holmes was immediately on his feet. The body, where? Is it now? Still where it was found, Mr. Holmes. The tide's coming in, so we'll need to retrieve it soon, but I thought you'd want to see it undisturbed. Quite right, Holmes agreed, already reaching for his coat. Watson, our investigation has taken an unexpected turn. It seems the closure of the gateway may not have been as complete as we believed. As we prepared to follow the constable, I noticed Eleanor carefully re-rolling the ancient parchment and returning it to its silver container. Her hands trembled slightly, but her expression was resolute. I'm coming with you, she declared, anticipating her father's objection. If this is connected to the covenant, I have more reason than anyone to see this through to its conclusion. Holmes regarded her with newfound respect. "Indeed you do, Miss Blackwood. Indeed you do." Sherlock Holmes and the Cry That Froze. The Abbey Chapter 13, the 13th generation. Lord Blackwood hesitated before the sealed doorway. "Mr. Holmes, if someone has breached this chamber after centuries of deliberate sealing, we may face dangers beyond your experience." "Perhaps," Holmes acknowledged, "but I have found that the most extraordinary dangers often have surprisingly ordinary explanations. Watson, your revolver." I withdrew my service revolver, checking that it was loaded. "At your disposal, Holmes." Together, Holmes and Lord Blackwood removed the loose bricks, creating an opening large enough to pass through. Beyond lay darkness and a damp, briny smell, suggesting proximity to the sea. We entered in single file, Holmes leading with the lamp. The light revealed a circular room carved from the living rock. The walls were inscribed with symbols similar to those in the chapel, but more elaborate. At the centre stood a stone altar, and beyond it the far wall was interrupted by a vertical fissure, extending from floor to ceiling. "The true gateway," Eleanor whispered. Holmes approached the altar. Its surface showed evidence of recent use: candle wax, ashes in a brazier, and a silver tube identical to the one found beneath the chapel. "A second anchor," Holmes observed. The light revealed a writing desk with papers neatly arranged, and, beside it, a chair draped with a familiar garment. "That's Selinger's coat," Eleanor exclaimed. A sudden gust of wind from the fissure, impossible given our location deep within the cliff, nearly extinguished the lamp. "We are not alone," Holmes said quietly. From the shadows emerged Graves, the Ravencroft butler, his customary impassive expression intact, though his eyes held new intensity. "Mr. Holmes," he acknowledged with a slight bow. "I had hoped to complete my work before you discovered this place." Lord Blackwood stared in disbelief. "Graves? What is the meaning of this?" "Forgive me, my lord. I have served the Blackwood family faithfully for 40 years, but my first loyalty lies elsewhere." He gestured toward the ancient symbols. "To an ancient obligation that predates your lineage's stewardship of Ravencroft." "You are not merely a servant," Holmes stated. "You are a guardian, tasked with ensuring the covenant remains fulfilled. Yes, I am the current keeper, the last in a line stretching back to before the Norman conquest. We have worked in shadow, ensuring each generation of Blackwoods maintained their part of the bargain." "And Professor Selinger discovered your activities through his research." "Indeed. The professor was most persistent and, unfortunately, most indiscreet. He located the chapel anchor and attempted the ritual without proper understanding. The consequences were inevitable." "You killed him?" Lord Blackwood demanded. "I did nothing of the sort. The professor killed himself through his own recklessness. The entity does not tolerate improper approaches." Eleanor examined the papers on the desk. "These are Selinger's missing notes and diagrams of both gateways." "Which you removed after his death," Holmes observed, "to conceal the connection." Graves inclined his head. "It was necessary. The chapel was never meant to be a functioning portal, merely a symbolic representation." "And yet something manifested there," I pointed out. "Because the veil had been thinned by Selinger's actions and my subsequent rituals here," Graves explained. "Last night was the appointed time for renewal of the covenant. and young Thomas discovered you," Holmes concluded. "A regrettable occurrence. The boy was not meant to witness what emerged from the fissure. His heart could not withstand the sight. Lord Blackwood had grown pale. All these years you have been conducting forbidden rituals beneath my home. Not forbidden, my lord. Necessary. The Covenant has protected your family and these lands for centuries." Graves turned to Eleanor. "Miss Blackwood, as the 13th generation, you must understand the importance of what I safeguard. The Covenant ends with you, and decisions must be made." The document mentioned a final choice at the 13th generation. What precisely does that entail? Before Graves could answer, a vibration began to emanate from the fissure. The air thickened, and that familiar pressure against the eardrums returned. "It comes," Graves said. "The entity senses the presence of the 13th descendant and seeks resolution." Holmes positioned himself between Eleanor and the fissure. Whatever this covenant entails, it was made without informed consent and maintained through deception. Such arrangements have no legal or moral standing. "This is beyond your jurisdiction, Mr. Holmes," Graves replied with newfound authority. "The Covenant transcends human law." The fissure began to emit a bluish luminescence, and the familiar keening sound started to build. "Eleanor," Lord Blackwood urged, "we must leave immediately." But his daughter stood firm. "As a scholar, and as the 13th generation, I need to understand what this truly means." She turned to Graves. "What does the entity require of the Shir? Final keeper? A choice. To renew the covenant for another 13 generations, or to end it forever. But ending it requires—" Holmes moved decisively toward the altar, seizing the silver tube. "These anchors serve as focal points, physical links that maintain the connection between worlds." He strode to the fissure and thrust the tube directly into the heart of the growing blue light. There was a sound like shattering glass, and the tube seemed to dissolve into the light, which flared brilliantly before collapsing. The vibration ceased, and the chamber fell silent. "What have you done?" Graves whispered, his composure finally broken. "Terminated an unconscionable arrangement," Holmes replied calmly. "By returning its tether to its own realm, I have severed the connection. But the consequences will likely be far less severe than you have been led to believe," Holmes interrupted. "Generations of keepers have maintained this deception, each bound by the indoctrination of their predecessors. As we departed, the first full daylight streaming through the windows seemed to cleanse away the lingering shadows of the night's events." "You seem certain that dissolving this covenant won't bring disaster," I remarked. "The true disaster, Watson, would be allowing such archaic arrangements to perpetuate indefinitely, binding future generations to obligations they neither understand nor choose." He glanced at Eleanor. "Miss Blackwood will now have the freedom to define her own relationship with her family's past, as a scholar rather than as an unwitting pawn." The ancient structure seemed somehow lighter, as if a weight of centuries had been lifted from its stones. The cry that had frozen the Abbey would be heard no more.